Hi there, and welcome to Colour Fit Chat number 12. This week we're incredibly lucky to have Matt Springham on the show, although my wife is a little furious with him because after reading his CV, it's left me feeling a little impotent. So here we go. Matt is Senior Lecturer in Strength and Conditioning Science and Exercise Physiology at St Mary's University. He's a Technical Lead in Strength and Conditioning at the Royal Ballet Company. Matt is a UKSCA accredited strength and conditioning coach, BASES accredited sport and exercise scientist, a chartered scientist and fellow of the HEA, and he's currently completing his PhD looking at training load, performance and fatigue. On top of all that, Matt has worked in professional football for over 12 years, working in several Premier League, Championship and English national teams. In this episode, Matt talks about nutrition principles he's seen work in football, the challenges in working with elite ballet dancers, and he discusses his current research regarding training load for football and ballet. It's an absolutely fantastic show, and remember, if you want to add opinion or questions, then please get involved with the Colour Fit Chat, which is on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Really hope you enjoy the show.
Okay, guys, thanks for listening in. The first question that I've been asked is to explain what the biggest nutritional lessons are that I've learned from working in football. Before I get into that, I guess I've got to state I'm not a nutritionist by training. I've got a relatively basic understanding, consistent with graduate level, sports science education, that sort of stuff. But in my experience, the most important thing is to make sure that the basics are in place before you try to get into the more, detail and intricacies of nutritional understanding with players, because oftentimes it's the basics that aren't in place in most of, well, certainly in the cohorts that I've worked with, most football players. And so I would tend to box food groups off into basic messages, foods that promote health, foods that promote energy, foods that promote recovery. And try and make sure that there's a logical balance and a sensible balance in those things. And then once we've developed that kind of level of understanding, we might get into some more sort of macronutrient ratio analysis in players, making sure that the amount of carbohydrate, proteins and fats are consistent with the type of training intensities and volumes that we're asking those guys to do. Which again is very much a relatively simple process. And then if you're lucky to have the resource, which a lot of teams until relatively recently haven't been, but having an expert in sports nutrition, I think would be very high on my agenda were I to go back in as a head of sports science at a football club again. Someone who's got a higher level of understanding of sports nutrition than I do, which I've said is relatively limited. To be fair, it's not my areas of speciality. But then I think the key thing to consider here is trying to promote a culture such that the players make sensible decisions in the other 20 or 22 hours of their day when there isn't a sports scientist, or a member of the sport and exercise science support team to guide them through their food choices, so that the culture is in place for them to eat correctly and make the right decisions. Okay, the next question that I've been asked is to explain what the best integrated nutritional support services that I've experienced at a professional football club. And the honest answer is I've experienced a very varied level of nutritional support service in professional football. I've been fortunate and unfortunate to work in environments where I am, I guess, the sole lead in sports nutrition, and I have a fairly limited understanding of sports nutrition, compared to those guys that have gone on to do specialist postgrad degrees in that area and PhDs and applied research. And I've been fortunate to work in environments where we have consultant sports nutritionists, specialists that have got a much greater detailed understanding than I have. But the best environment I've worked with, the best practice that I've seen, was at the last football club that I worked at, and the structure was very much integrated in that we had a team of sports scientists and S&C coaches that were tracking training volumes and training load and communicating these things to a sports nutritionist and a specialist sports nutritionist that was trying to map training volume and intensity and appropriately periodize nutritional intake, around the forecasted fluctuation in volume and load. And bits and pieces were individualized. So there was some food diary analysis, and there was some analysis of some systemic markers to inform the types of food groups that individuals should be consuming. And I guess on top of that, we were doing bi-weekly salivary analysis of stress and immunoendocrine markers, so we could, I guess more on a more individual basis, inform things like probiotic supplementation and antioxidant supplementation. And then, we coupled that with just some basic logical hygiene practices around the training ground and stadium. So, we used antibacterial handles around the training ground. We used alcohol gels. We tried to limit handshaking. And we did these things to simply promote good hygienic practice, good nutritional practice, limiting the risk of illness. And I have to say, in that case, we had a very good season in terms of injury and illness occurrence. Okay, the next question that I've been asked is, what is the primary challenge of working with professional ballet dancers? So I'm sure that very, very few people will know, but in the last couple of years, I moved away from working full-time in professional football to working in a part academic role at St Mary's University, where I teach strength and conditioning and sports science undergrad and postgrad students. And I do like a technical lead role at the Royal Ballet Company, where I lead the strength and conditioning coaches that we have embedded at the Royal Ballet Company. And I guess to understand the demands of ballet, or to understand this problem better, it's probably easiest to compare it to an environment like a field sport training environment like football. So in football, players arrive generally a similar time in the morning. They have their meals at fixed times around training, and you can very easily plan the timing of their meals around training to optimize recovery, or help to optimize recovery, certainly. But the main problem with ballet is that at the Royal Ballet, we've got around 90 professional dancers, and each of those dancers generally have individualized timetables of rehearsals for different levels of shows and different roles of shows. So it's very hard to accurately periodize their meal times and their nutritional practice consistently across the week. And so education around timing of intake of food and trying to promote a snacking based culture, as opposed to 2, 3, 4 maybe primary meals per day, is really important. And it's important in this case because these guys often train for 6 to 8 hours a day as opposed to 2, and so we need a sustained level of energy exposure across the day to satisfy those energetic demands, really. So combine this kind of picture of high training load with the fact that there's a huge pressure on ballet dancers to be very lean because of aesthetic reasons, and it's a bit of a concoction for the potential of problems like relative energy deficit, for example, which rears its head at times in our environment. And so, yes, it's a very complex problem, and I would say that the primary challenge of working in ballet is regulating energy intake across the day and satisfying energetic needs such that the anthropometric profile of dancers is healthy and optimal. Okay, the final question that I've been asked is to talk through what my ongoing research is and how I hope it will impact performance. And I guess the easiest way to answer this is to split my ongoing research between football and ballet, because my personal research is in football, but then we've got PhD students embedded at the Royal Ballet that are doing really, really interesting stuff. And so let's start with the football stuff. So My research in football is exploring the relationships between load and performance, and load and salivary biomarkers principally, so immune measures and hormones. And the reason that I'm interested in the relationship between load and performance is because the general narrative in research in football at the moment is in exploring the relationship between load and injury. And a lot of the criticisms around football science at the moment are concerned with creating like a very conservative approach to sports science support, as opposed to creating like a performance-led approach, trying to drive better athletes that are excellent football players, for example. And so, we've collected a lot of data over a number of years to explore these relationships, and our data interestingly shows that some of the exponentially weighted moving average chronic markers of high intensity load are associated with better match play physical performances when you statistically control for situational and contextual variables in games. And our ongoing work is modeling the contributing load variables that most closely relate to changes in players' immune function and players' endocrine function. And obviously endocrine function is very important when it comes to player recovery, and recovery status is in a constant state of flux across the competitive season. So these are the things that I'm interested in, and what I hope is going to happen is that I'm going to produce some research that impacts, I wouldn't say changes, but impacts the research narrative around load. And whilst accepting that injury is very important and we need to mitigate injury risk, trying to create more of a positive message around the beneficial effects of chronic load, in terms of contributing to performance. And then our ongoing work at the ballet is very novel, actually, because there's historically been very little research in professional ballet dancers of any real quality, if I'm honest, in terms of quantifying load in the same way that the field sports science groups do. So, for example, there's very little data published on quantifying jump load and jump intensity, in ballet dancers, and understanding what that looks like, per day, per week, per month, per year, and how that relates to injury risk, illness risk, and performance. And so we're modelling these things, to give you an idea. Our data demonstrates that dancers might jump anywhere up to 4,000 times a week, which might equate to 16 to 20,000 jumps per month. And we're very interested in what the implications of that type of load are, so that we can start shaping best practice recommendations for managing professional dancers, i.e. The boundaries that might be deemed to be safe, and the physical profiles that might be useful moderators to injury risk in ballet dancers, be it strength, eccentric strength, concentric strength, plyometric capacity, those sorts of things. That's our primary interest at the ballet. So really, in short, across both of those activities, so football and ballet, trying to understand some of the factors that underpin performance, relate to injury but underpin performance, and trying to produce some work that S&C coaches and sports scientists in practice can instantly apply to their daily practice would be amazing for me to see.
So a huge thanks to Matt there for his far-reaching expertise. He discussed how nutrition in football should focus on getting the basics right, of periodising nutrition around training load and competition structures. Specialist nutritionalists are a great aid to this, and they're becoming increasingly common, which is a great thing. A good resource to help players away from the training ground is integral, and this is a shameless plug, but this is why ColourFit is doing so well, as it provides intuitive and practical guide to making appropriate meals away from the club. And if you want a trial, please get in touch. One of the main challenges in supporting ballet dancers is balancing the energy provision needed for their extensive training loads against the aesthetic needs to be extremely lean. And this requires good planning, regular snacking, a focus on nutrients, and education to avoid the disastrous consequences of RED-S. Matt's PhD research sounds absolutely fascinating, We certainly have a cultural problem of overprotecting our players in the UK, but with Matt's research indicating that high chronic loads have a beneficial effects on performance and injury, it's key we don't fall into this trap. Applying high loads when appropriate is going to be beneficial both to performance and injury. Load within ballet dancers is in its infancy, but they clearly are exposed to very high loads, so I can't wait to see what Matt's research group produces in terms of guidelines. Thanks again to Matt, and please subscribe and review the Colour Fit podcast, and you can see the full videos on the Colour Fit YouTube. Take care, and hopefully I'll see you next week.